Hello, I'm going to talk us through the discussion prep questions for today's discussion. This is for February 9th/10th. So first of all, make sure you are in the right place in your book, chapter 3. This is pages 38 through 58, or page 53 in the PDF. The beginning of the chapter looks like this. It says, here's the family, mother, father, Dick and Jane. They live in the green and white house, blah, blah, blah. So make sure you're in the right place in your book. Again, page 53 in the PDF, page 38 in the physical book. All right, so let's look at the first question here. So what is the significance of the point of view or narrator in this chapter? What does it convey about defining beauty? So just like we talked about in chapter 2, you have to think about who is the narrator in this chapter. It's not Claudia. How does the narrator characterize the Breedloves in these pages? So let's look at some of the words that the narrator uses to characterize the Breedloves. They lived there because they were poor and black, and they stayed there because they believed they were ugly. Their ugliness was unique. The narrator also describes how like their eyes, their foreheads, their hairlines, the low irregular hairlines, heavy eyebrows, keen but crooked noses with insolent nostrils. So insolent means rude or arrogant. How can nostrils be insolent, right? Is this an objective description of what someone's nostrils look like? I don't think so. Right? And then also I want you to think about, like, what does this narrator represent, right? So obviously the narrator is describing the Breedloves in this very negative way, similar to the way that the narrator described their house in the previous chapter. So you have to ask yourself, do I agree with this? I would also push you to look at page 46, where Pecola kind of, you get a description of Pecola on page 46, where it says, her teeth were good, and at least her nose was not big and flat like some of those who were thought so cute. So it's like we also have evidence that Pecola is not necessarily like objectively ugly. So what does this narrator represent? So I want you to consider a couple of places. The narrator on page 39 says, you looked at them and wondered why they were so ugly. You looked closely and could not find the source. Then you realized that it came from conviction, their conviction. So if the narrator is this omniscient point of view, what does this convey about defining beauty? And why are they saying you? Why is the narrator saying you looked at them and you felt this way, right? They're involving you in this. So why is that? What does this show about definitions of beauty? All right, question 2. Actually, so pause here. Answer question 1. So here are some, again, guiding questions that you can use when you pause. You can use these guiding questions to help you answer this first question. So go ahead and pause, answer this first question now in your document. Okay, we're back. We're going to go on to question 2. So where does Pecola fall within the stages of racial identity development? So I linked in your classwork this document about the stages of racial identity development. This is basically a document that summarizes several frameworks. So a framework is just a way of looking at something that have been developed to describe stages of racial and ethnic identity development. So this comes from like psychology and therapy literature. This is not like every person will go through these stages in life. It's not that. This is kind of just some general guidelines about how people in different groups tend to move through different stages in how they feel about their own identity. So looking at the people of color stages, and again, this is not like this is 100% accurate. This is just people who study this, people in these communities have kind of come up with these stages as a way to describe, things that people feel about their own identities throughout their lives, things that people tend to feel. So we're going to look at some of these stages. So Start with pre-encounter. People at this stage have absorbed many beliefs and values of the dominant white culture, including the notion that white is right and black is wrong. There's a de-emphasis on one's racial group membership. People at this stage are largely unaware of race or racial implications. Then there's encounter, where people are forced by events or a series of events to acknowledge the impact of racism in one's life. And the reality that one cannot truly be white. They're forced to focus on identity as a member of a group targeted by racism. Then there's immersion/emersion, where there's a desire to surround oneself with visible symbols of one's racial identity. So moving past the notion that like white is right or the racism that one experiences, people at this next stage are kind of actively avoid symbols of whiteness. They seek out opportunities to explore aspects of one's own history and culture with support of peers from one's own racial background. And then there's internalization and internalization-commitment, which are kind of like the final stages of being empowered in one's racial identity, secure in that identity, and have actually, the last stage is committed to like a plan of action or a commitment to sort of the progress of that group, essentially. So thinking through these stages, like we know Pecola is not empowered or secure in her identity, right? So of these first three stages, where do you think she falls on those stages of racial identity development? And why is this chapter significant? What happens to Pecola? Who does she encounter in this chapter? That sort of tells us, or that moves her into a certain stage in her racial identity development. Why are these events in this chapter important in this? So pause, answer question 2. Okay, question 3. So how does Morrison's use of imagery work to convey a social commentary about defining beauty? So imagery is a description that appeals to the 5 senses. Primarily, we're looking at visual imagery in this chapter. So looking at pages 47 through 48. So let's focus on, so we're after the fight between Mr. and Mrs. Breedlove. Starting on page 47, we're looking at dandelions. She's looking at dandelions, right? So first she says, she doesn't get why she wonders, do people call them weeds, right? She thought they were pretty. So she's looking at the dandelions. Then she has this encounter with Mr. Jakubowski, the store owner. And then so she has this encounter with this guy. And then on page 50, we have a description of the Mary Jane wrappers. And you'll notice after this encounter, her feelings towards dandelions change. They are ugly. They are weeds. So why? Why do her feelings change, right? What do the dandelions represent, right? This image of the dandelions, what do they represent? What is the significance of Mr. Jakubowski's treatment of Pecola? How does this reflect society's view of her? So, there's this whole part where he does not see her because for him there is nothing to see. What does that mean? What is Morrison saying about society in general? And how does Pecola's admiration of the Mary Jane candy reflect where she falls on the stages of racial identity development? So on page 50, we have each pale yellow wrapper has a picture on it. So that paragraph, what is this? How does this relate to those stages of racial identity development that we looked at in question 2? All right, so there you go. Go ahead and answer question 3. I hope this was helpful to you. And we will get ready to talk about these questions together as a class.